Merry Christmas. It's Christmas morning. We've journeyed through Advent together. It's been such a fun journey to go through faith and joy and hope and peace. But now it's Christmas morning, what we've been anticipating for the last month. And today, Abby Olcese, she joins us one final time as we look at the film Children of Men. And she and I discuss how amazing it is that a child, Jesus, was born, a vulnerable infant, to humans who would raise him up so that one day he could go and die on the cross to save humanity, the ones who raised him. It's a great conversation. I think you're going to enjoy it. So sit down and enjoy this episode of the Live Faith First podcast. Well, Merry Christmas. We have journeyed together through Advent and we're here at Christmas. We've spent time focused on hope and faith and joy and peace. And now we celebrate Christmas Day, the day we observe Jesus's birth. Now, before we move forward into the day, let's stop and go back. Christmas is a day of gifts, trees, sadness for loved ones missed, for children that have grown up. I know that Christmas is not the same in my house now that our daughter is 19, 20 years old. It's just different now. Still amazing joy, though, because there's also additions to the family. Not by my daughter, that there are, new people joining the family parties, right? The day goes by fast, and it may be different than the way we celebrated growing up or even last year. So as we navigate all of that, all that Christmas Day brings, let's stop for a moment and go back to the day of Jesus' birth, what he was entering into that day. We do have hope, faith, joy, and peace, right? So Jesus' birthday, and we're going to get to Abby in just one second here, but Jesus' birthday was a new day dawning, a catastrophic shift in history. It was a commencement of a revolution, but it would take time to get there. So Abby, thank you again for joining us to discuss. Now we're moving out of Advent and into Christmas. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I am really excited we've made it to Christmas. So this is a monumental day. We've been working on this for the last 24 days now. And now that we're here, would you tell us a little bit, if we were to go back 2,000 years, what kind of environment was Jesus entering into? What was that world that he was born into? Give us a snapshot of that.
So it was a pretty chaotic one. There's a lot going on. There's Roman rule. There's a whole bunch of different religious sects that have sort of an idea of where things are going to go. A lot of them are at war with each other. I'll read you a quote from my chapter on Christmas that comes from a biblical scholar named Pete Enns, who's talking about another biblical scholar named John Dominic Crossan. If you took someone who knew nothing of Jesus, but did understand that the religious political powder keg of first century Palestine, tensions between various Jewish groups with different ideas about God and how to live in their own land under Roman rule, and tensions between Jewish and Greco-Roman customs, now centuries old, and then handed that person the Gospel of Mark, that person wouldn't be far into it before asking, who is this Jesus, and when is he going to be killed?
Yes.
So it's, to put it mildly, it was difficult. It was very, very fractioned, very divided, and in many cases violently so. And so you have this very vulnerable baby born to two parents who are not powerful people, into a situation that is anything but stable. And very shortly after his birth, Herod finds out about the birth of Jesus, and rather than welcoming him, decides that he's going to try and find this Jesus and kill him as a baby because he is a threat to his power. So from Jesus's very arrival, things are not smooth, and they will not be throughout his entire life. It starts basically the way that his entire ministry is going to go. And that is not easy, and something that involves quite a lot of sacrifice from everybody involved, Jesus included. So that's the part of the Christmas story that fascinates me the most, is that as a baby, Jesus needed a lot of protection to be brought into the world and to survive in it. Not just on a basic level, but at a larger existential level as well. And so Christmas for me is as much a recognition of all of the people around Jesus who kind of helped that prophecy come to fruition, as it
Yeah.
is about the existence of Jesus himself.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's such an interesting world, and we always talk about infant Jesus. We see that depicted. That's part of the Christmas tradition. We understand that, but when you think of the vulnerability of God in the human infant form, um, for whatever reason, God chose to entrust himself
Mm-hmm.
into, Mary was most likely a teenager. Joseph was, most likely, I don't know, 20s, maybe 30s, but which was a kind of a traditional time. So this was not an unusual, creepy kind of setup here, but he was probably a little further into his carpenter career, but still blue collar. So you kind of
Mm-hmm.
have this teenage girl and a blue collar worker, and they're trying to figure it out. And then in this power hungry Roman Greek world, and like you've already talked about, the religious factions, some trying to suck up to Rome, some trying to rebel against Rome. And in
Mm-hmm.
the midst of this, everybody's looking for a savior. And that's why the Romans try to kill Jesus, because
Mm-hmm.
they're afraid that there's another king that's being born. And we can't have that here in Israel. And so, yeah, it is incredible. And I definitely want us to talk about this vulnerability and frailty of Jesus, but not but and the movie you chose was Children of Men, which is
Mm-hmm.
just, again, and I've said this, I believe, on at least 4 out of the 5 podcasts. I love this movie. This is great. I
Good.
had never seen it before. It's super fun.
Yeah.
And my wife and I both looked at each other after watching it and went, how did we never see this before? Like, how did this never come across our suggested movies that Netflix or Prime or whomever's supposed to give us? So tell us about Children of Men. Such a cool movie. Would you tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, so Children of Men is it's an adaptation of a novel of the same name by the author P.D. James, who, it should be noted, is Christian, and so any parallels to the Nativity story are intentional. So that's all. It's the subtext is text here, which is one of the many reasons that I think this movie is so fascinating. It's set in a near future that is not that far from our own. In fact, it is 2027, so it is 3 years in our future. And in this future, women are unable to give birth. There is some kind of mysterious medical plague that of infertility, basically. So there are no new generations being born. When the movie opens, the youngest person on the planet has just been killed, and they call him Baby Diego, and he is 18 years old. So that gives you a sense of how long it has been. The main character is a man named Theo, played by Clive Owen, who is kind of a government functionary in this world. And he's kind of a disaffected bureaucrat, and he is one day kind of out of the blue contacted by his ex-wife Julian, and she is she's a radical, basically. She is in charge of a group of revolutionaries. In this future, Britain is basically one of the last stable governments on the planet, and is home to a lot of refugees. And these refugees, as soon as they show up, basically are put into refugee camps that are just slums. They're living in kind of crumbling, war-torn slums, and their quality of life is really horrible. Which gives you a sense of, like, if they have to come here, how bad is it where they came from? Because it must be worse, but it can't be
Yeah.
much worse. So all of this is happening. There's a lot of just difficult stuff going on. And out of all this, Julian plucks Theo out of the world that he's in because she needs help transporting a young woman named Key and her companion, Marion. And it turns out that Key is pregnant miraculously. She is the only person in the world who is pregnant. And Julian wants Theo's help to get Key to something called the Human Project, which is a group of people who are trying to figure out the cure for this infertility epidemic that's going on. And they think that Key and her miracle baby may be the answer to saving the future of humanity. And it turns out that Julian is not the only person with designs on what to do with Key and her baby. There are other people who want to use that baby for their own political gain. And that kind of leads to a lot of, some violence, and the initial plan to try and get Key to the Human Project kind of going off the rails and having to go in a different direction. And Theo ends up taking a much more active role in Key and her baby's protection than he had initially expected to. And so the film follows them as they try to get to the Human Project, which eventually takes them through a refugee camp and through the birth of Key's baby, and ends on kind of an ambiguous note where things seem like they're probably going to continue, like that things are going to go well, but it's going to be an uphill climb.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting in that movie, the support that Key and Theo needed to get to, they're aiming for a ship, they're aiming for a boat, right? But to get to that boat, and you think of, now, was it is that his dad that the pot smoking out in the
right?
out in
No,
the country?
I think it's a friend. So he, before kind of the world sort of fell apart, Theo and Julian were activists themselves, and they were friends with this man named Jasper, who's played by Michael Caine, who was a prominent political cartoonist. And as soon as everything kind of falls apart, Jasper and his wife, who was also an activist, and suffers kind of a grave injury that makes her essentially a vegetable, they had to go into hiding. And so there's a few times where Theo kind of gets a break from his life by going to visit Jasper, who now lives in the woods and kind of grows his own strain of weed, and is trying to live in peace as much as he can. But it's pretty difficult,
Right.
And not without its own compromises.
Yeah. But just that idea of what it took to get Key, this African-American, I guess she wasn't American, but this
African,
Black
woman,
right? This African woman who doesn't know who the dad is, but not that it's a miraculous birth. It was just a matter of, this is how I got through life, was just, somebody got me pregnant here.
Yeah.
But then there's this scene near the end. You got to talk about the scene in the apartment building where there's war, there's shooting, there's craziness, and there's a baby that's been born that they're trying to keep quiet, but the baby can't keep quiet. Would you walk us through that scene? It just
oh my gosh,
had to be like, that has to be I call it the centerpiece scene, like that.
Oh, for sure.
That is the one, right?
Yeah. And there are a number of shots in this film that are kind of, they're unbroken, like they're single take shots. And this is one that is made up of, I think, a few, like there's very few cuts in this scene. It really follows what happens as it's happening and wants you to be as present in the moment as possible. And it's not dissimilar from like we talked about Peace last week with Joy and Noel, and it's this moment of surprising peace and quiet that comes in the middle of just vast conflict on all of these different sides. So Theo and Key have gotten into this refugee camp, and their plan is to kind of go through the refugee camp, come out the other side, and get to the coast where they can be picked up by the Human Project. But that basically involves them turning themselves in as refugees and like basically prisoners of war. And so they are stuck in this bombed out apartment building. There is there's rebellion going on all sides. So there are soldiers firing. There are refugee people who have absolutely had it and are fighting back. A lot of the imagery in this section is actually like designed to look like parts of Iraq, because again, it came out during the Iraq War. And so Theo and Key are in this bombed out apartment building, and Key, it just gives birth. It's time for the baby to come. She goes into labor. She gives birth. This wasn't the plan, but it is what it is. And she has this baby, and they're trying to, like, he's trying to teach her how to care for the baby, how to nurse the baby in this really unsanitary, very dirty setting. And of course, they can't help but keep the baby from crying because it's a baby. The baby doesn't know to keep quiet. And the sound of the baby crying just shocks everybody around, because they haven't heard that sound for about 18 years. This is a completely new thing to them. And so those who understand what it means just kind of stop in their tracks, and because they don't know what else to do. So Theo and Key are able to get up. and they wrap the baby in Theo's coat. They walk out of the building and past these soldiers who, for one blessed moment, everybody is completely still. One of the soldiers makes the sign of the cross because he clearly is like, he's shocked, and he's also aware that this is a very significant moment. And the two of them are able to get about a block away before something blows up and everything starts again.
Yes.
And it's like, we're right back where we were, except now we have a baby, and this baby is vulnerable, and this baby is constantly in danger, and we need to get out now. So it has this really kind of beautiful, quiet moment that on the other end of it is not only harrowing, but even more harrowing than it already was.
Yeah. Yeah. And the fear in Theo and Key's eyes as they decided they had to walk down, because
Mm-hmm.
they didn't know how people would respond. There continued to be this fear in the movie of, will they take my baby?
Mm-hmm.
Will they be used for political means, as you've already said? These are government soldiers. Are they obligated to grab the baby and take it to safety? So it
Right.
was interesting that there was this tension as well. Not only were there bullets flying everywhere, but then as they quietly walked out, well, Key and Theo were quiet. The baby was
Yeah.
crying. But as they quietly walked out, the amazement and the peace that kind of ensued around them for just that bubble, which again harkens back to our last episode, where sometimes peace is a bubble
Mm-hmm.
that immediately returns back. Hopefully it doesn't, but sometimes it does.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what, Tell me some of the connections. I mean, they're fairly obvious, I suppose,
Yeah.
but give me some connections between Jesus' birth story and Children of Men. What are the ones that stood out
Sure.
to you?
So like the biggest obviously is the miracle pregnancy. And in Key's case, like it did come about through intercourse, but like it shouldn't have happened based on like the medical experiences of everybody around her. So the fact that she is pregnant at all is a miracle. And there's a pretty interesting, like kind of funnily pointed moment where uh, Theo, all that Theo knows for a while is that Key needs to be transported somewhere and that he needs to help her. And so he's doing that because Julian told him to. And he doesn't know that she's pregnant. And so finally, the time comes where Marion, the nurse, decides that he has to know. This isn't going to go forward unless he knows exactly what the stakes are. So she brings Theo into this stable where Key is, and she reveals that she is pregnant. And Theo's response is, I mean, it's a curse, but he says, "Jesus Christ."
Yeah.
As if it wasn't obvious enough what's going on. It's just like, this is, oh, okay, great.
Yeah.
um so all of that, you also have all of this kind of political machinations that are going on around Key, that she did not ask for, that are fairly similar to all of the kind of different fractions of society that were going on around the Holy Family, whether or not they were directly aware of them or not, that all had to do with the hope of an arrival of a savior, what that would mean, and who he had come to save. Not realizing that what they were going to get was very different than what anybody had expected.
Yeah.
There's also the fact that in the film, that Key, being an African woman and a refugee, and in a country that isn't going to be welcoming to either of those things, that what's going to happen to her baby is like potentially very fraught. Like, we don't know if that baby's going to be taken away from her. We don't know if she will be accepted or cared for at all. And the fact that that Key is black and her baby is black, and that both are women, is pretty significant to what the future of humanity is going to look like. So
Yeah.
all of that kind of comes together. The fact that Theo is a not the father of the baby, but is kind of a surrogate dad, puts him in kind of a similar position to Joseph as well. And Key's baby being born where she is born is also kind of a nod to the difficulty of the nativity scene as well. That it's
Yeah.
not a comfortable place. It's not clean. It's not the event itself may be joyful, but there's also kind of a lot of fear and physical trauma involved. It's very real about like what that scene would have looked like in a way that we don't usually talk about around Christmas.
Yeah. No, yeah. I mean, even the blanket that the child was born into was
Mm-hmm.
Theo's overcoat that he had
Yeah.
been, running
Yeah.
around with, and who knows how long it was since he washed it, cleaned it. Like, I mean, it was
Right.
not, I mean, but that was the
Yeah.
cleanest piece of material they had to
Yeah. It's the
give, for
warmest,
this,
so this will work.
right. This will work. Right. And so, and a couple of the other parallels that I see, is that, the shepherds again. The
Hmm.
shepherds, they left their flocks to go see Jesus after the angel choir show up, and we see that kind of quietness, that desire to see what is going on, but the real world is happening around them.
Hmm.
And even we've talked about this a couple of times, but Anna and Simeon, who are at the temple, and for those of you who don't know that part of the story, pretty quickly after Jesus was born, part of a Jewish tradition was that you would take your child, basically to dedicate your child at the temple. Um, and I believe also, it doesn't say this explicitly, but to be circumcised as well. And so when Mary, Joseph, and Jesus got there, there were two people who had anticipated Jesus's birth. For in one case, I believe Anna had been there for almost 80 years, just waiting for basically Jesus to arrive. And so
Hmm.
those two people who just anticipated God's arrival, again, just connect us to this movie, that there's just people who they're expecting something. There is hope out there. There is, a desire for things to be different, for the world to be saved. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, such a cool, connections with that story. So yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that I find really interesting about what it's, yeah, one of the ways that I often envision the nativity story, I think this is because just when I was a kid, I was really into like the Harry Potter movies and the books. That there's a plethora of what's called like chosen one narratives in popular culture, in books and films and TV. Like, probably what I'm talking about. Like Harry Potter is an example of that. The boy who lived and needed to be brought up by surrogate parents, and that's, I mean, those are often, they're characters that come from humble circumstances. Often they are characters who are able to fulfill the thing that they are sent out to fulfill because of the expectance from other people or the sacrifice of other people around them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what allows them basically to survive and to get to the point where they can, save the world from the great big evil. And I feel like those are popular stories because they come from, from the Bible. They come from a story that has that kind of power and that kind of resonance.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we don't often talk about the sacrifice part of Jesus's birth. We talk about the arrival and how exciting that is, and that it is very exciting. It's important. But if you look, it doesn't take a terribly close read of the Bible to see that there are other people present at every stage who also come from circumstances that are pretty humble. They come from, you mentioned Anna and Simeon, people who sacrificed basically a normal life to sit around and wait for the Messiah, so when he showed up, they could take care of him. It's just all of these people who play small roles in a larger story that barely get mentioned, but their presence is important in order for that story to continue, which
Yeah.
I think is something that Children of Men also does really well.
Yeah. Yeah. And they, each of these characters that we talk about, they were tasked with one small piece in this larger story. And Christmas Day is not the end of the story. We
Mm-hmm.
celebrate it the most. It's so, as far as with gifts and all of the trappings that go around Christmas, but it's actually not about Christmas Day. It's
Mm-hmm.
about Jesus living for 33 years and then dying on a cross, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, as much as we're here celebrating Christmas, and we should, it's the birth of our Savior, and he came as a vulnerable child into really dirty circumstances, not just physically, but chaotic, cultural, political, geopolitical, all of that, which honestly, it's, as we look at our current present day, there's a lot of connection points to where
Mm-hmm.
Jesus was 2,000 years ago and what he was born into. And so I think for us to again be mindful that Christmas is great. And it's amazing season. I love Christmas. I love celebrating it. But without Easter, right? Without
Yeah.
Jesus's growing up and having people who could come alongside him as an infant and a toddler and teach him and train him and bring him along, he doesn't get to the cross. And that's so
Hmm.
weird to think, because I feel like you could drop like Jesus in the middle of the desert and somehow God would sustain him. But that's not how God chose to do it.
Yeah. It's
He
and
chose to use us.
yeah, I love that. I mean, as a film critic, this will probably not come as a surprise to you. I love story and I love the connections that kind of make up the entire arc of a story. And so this is like, again, yeah, like you mentioned, it's just the beginning. It's the first story in a series of stories. And so it is like kind of the exciting announcement that happens right at the beginning. And, there are all kinds of like quirks and interesting things that happen around it. Like, Elizabeth and Zachariah not being able to speak for the entirety of Elizabeth's pregnancy. And like, that's kind of funny. And, a little bit of an interesting side note. And then you get, the nativity story. And that is, beautiful and peaceful, and then you get right back to it, and it's chaos for a while, and then it all
Yes.
kind of culminates in this, again, 3-act story that is the ministry of Jesus and the calling of the disciples, and it just keeps going and going, and restarting and reconnecting, and the issues that underpin it are always the same. They're always kind of
Mhm.
connected to this sense of division and need for grace, need for forgiveness, and systems that aren't serving people who really need a lot of help, for people who are
Yeah.
really vulnerable, and it's just kind of a story of again and again, how we get closer and closer and closer, and then finally the fulfillment of that, and then even beyond the fulfillment of Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection, that we are called to carry out that story, that it's still not done, that this is an
Yes.
active thing that we are still part of. And I think being able to remember that each of these stories, while they are about one person, sort of like they're about Jesus, they're also really about all the people around Jesus at every step of that journey. Which
Yes.
is, it's kind of empowering, and then it's a reminder that our lives, as small as they are, we still have a role to play in the continuation of Jesus's ministry, even if our names are never remembered. That it's just that every little person and every little detail counts, and that without it, the whole thing kind of falls apart.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love that. And that's how God's chosen to do it. I think that's the fascinating thing to me, is that he chose a Mary and a Joseph. He
Mm-hmm.
chose a group of shepherds. He chose an Anna and a Simeon. He chose all these unnamed people. I mean, he had to go down to Egypt as a refugee, right? Like there were people along the way, in some caravan as he went down, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's so many unnamed people that we, when we're in heaven, we will see and we will get to understand and
Yeah.
get to know and hear those stories. But this side of glory, there's a lot of unnamed people, and this is not to put credit on those people, but somehow God chose to include them in the story to do the
Yeah.
good work of Jesus. And I don't get it. It's not how I would plan it out if I were God. But
Yeah.
clearly, that's a good thing I'm not God, because He seems to have this figured out better than I do.
Yeah. Yeah. It's,
So
I mean, all of it, I mean, obviously it's all intentional. And to me, at least, it's a reminder that everything is a communal, like even individual acts have communal impact, that everything is a communal
mm,
act, and it takes all of us to make it happen. The thing that is amazing is that God trusts us to continue that journey when
yes,
we
yes,
screw up so much of the time,
right,
in ways that are small and in ways that are big and ways that are systemic. It's just, it's important to remember that love sustains us amazingly, even through all of the times that we get it wrong.
yeah, yeah. Abby, I'm going to leave it with that.
Okay.
That's that sounds like the perfect conclusion to our 4 episodes on Advent and then Christmas, because that's that's what Christmas is about. It's about the hope, the faith, the joy, the peace, and the grace. And if it
Hmm.
wasn't for God's grace, choosing to use broken people, choosing to use people who just don't get it right, fallible people, we would not have part of this story. But somehow God's chosen to bring us into His story of His
Yeah.
Son showing up on this earth so that one day we can all get to spend time with God in heaven. And while we're here, just live out his love, his kindness, his mercy, his grace, his faith, his joy all around us. And so I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversations, Abby.
Thank
And
you.
thank you so much for joining the Live Faith First podcast. Y'all out there, I hope you have an amazing Christmas day. It may be kind of chaotic today. Hopefully, maybe this is a point of peace. Maybe you're watching this after Christmas and you're like, it was crazy. Still, enjoy, find some peace. It doesn't have to be on the 25th only. It can be on the 26th too. So I hope you have a great or had a great Christmas. And of course, everybody out there, let's go live faith first.